Mr. President, I'd like to talk today about the need for a work requirement in our Medicaid program. In 1969, Mr. President, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the American people, and he talked about breaking the cycle of poverty. And this is what President Johnson said, I quote, he said, "I believe that the key to success in this effort is jobs." He said it is work for people who want to work, end quote. Now, President Johnson, as we know, was a Democrat. He fervently believed that the people of Louisiana didn't want handouts. Most people want a chance to support themselves. President Johnson also believed that Medicaid, as originally envisioned, would be a safety net for the disabled, the elderly, and people with small children. Medicaid's not exactly that, Mr. President. It's dramatically different. Whether you agree or disagree with what's happened to Medicaid, the fact is that it's turned into a health insurance program for about 20% of all Americans. Now think about that. We have roughly 320 million people in our country. Fully 25% are on Medicaid. It gets bigger and bigger every year, and it gets more expensive every year. You can see the numbers speak for themselves. 1996, you can see the trend, Mr. President. You can certainly see we start in 1966, you can particularly see the trend beginning in 1996 and the trajectory. It's also, Cassie, if I could see that other chart, it's also become more expensive. This was the cost of our Medicaid program in 1966. $1 billion, a lot of money. This is the cost of last year, $576 billion and climbing. Let me just talk about my state alone. In Louisiana, the cost of Medicaid has increased from $5.9 billion in 2008 to $10.7 billion today. 65% of all of the babies born in Louisiana every year now are born on Medicaid. Think about that. Now, we know that Medicaid is a federal state program. The federal government puts up some of the money. The state puts up some of the money as well. We put up in Louisiana about a third of the money. In Louisiana dollars, in 2008, we were putting up $1.7 billion in state money. It's called the match for the Medicaid program. Today, the state of Louisiana is paying $3.3 billion. You can do the math. That's about a 10% increase every year. If we're spending $3.3 billion of state money, that means that every year, just like clockwork, we have to come up with an extra $330 million. And I can tell you where that money comes from. It comes out of public schools, it comes out of universities, it comes out of our budget for roads, and it comes out of our budget for public safety. We have a choice in America, Mr. President. Either Medicaid is going to be, as we originally envisioned it, a safety net for the old, the disabled, mothers with babies, or it's going to be a health insurance program for the masses. Now, if the American people and Congress decide that Medicaid is going to be a health insurance program for the general population, then it needs to operate like health insurance does in the private sector. In other words, able-bodied adult enrollees in Medicaid should be required to work in order to receive their benefits if they are able. I'm filing a bill, Mr. President. It's going to be entitled Medicaid Reform and Personal Responsibility Act of 2017. It's going to create a work requirement for Medicaid. My reason is simple. I want Americans to prosper. I don't want our people to remain mired in poverty. I want to break poverty's back by creating a system that that doesn't force the American people to subsist on handouts from government. And the best way to do that is to provide an incentive for able-bodied Americans to know the dignity of work. Because a person without a job, Mr. President, is neither happy nor is he free. Now, I think my bill is a common sense approach to reducing America's reliance on entitlement programs. The work requirement will be very simple. It will be similar to the program that we have in place, the work requirement we have in place right now, Mr. President, for food stamps. This is what my bill would require. If you are on Medicaid or want to receive Medicaid, and you are an adult between the ages of 18 and 55, and you are able-bodied, you're not disabled, and you don't have any dependents, you don't have any children. So you're 18 to 55, you're not disabled, and you don't have any children. Then in order to receive Medicaid or to continue to receive Medicaid, you have to either work 20 hours a week, not 40 hours a week, 20 hours a week, you have to look for a job, or you have to go back to school if you don't want to work, or if you don't want to go back to school, or you don't want to look for a job, or you don't want to get a job, you've got to perform community service for 20 hours a week. My goal is to get people off Medicaid into the workforce so they can support themselves and not need Medicaid. I don't want to take Medicaid away from people in need. I do want fewer people to need Medicaid. So if you're disabled, if you're pregnant, if you're elderly, if you're caring for a child, my bill doesn't apply to you. I'm not talking about telling a mother with a baby in her arms that she's got to go find a job. And I'm not going to ask an elderly person in a nursing home to leave the nursing home and go get a job in order to receive Medicaid. All my bill says, if you're young by today's standards, between 18 and 55, you're able-bodied and you have no children or dependents, then you've got to go get a job, or you've got to go to school, or you've got to perform community service. Now, I want to be very clear about something else, Mr. President. In my state, we have a lot of flood victims. We've had terrible flooding last year. In my state, Louisiana, we have a depression in the oil and gas industry. Indeed, we do throughout America, and I don't know we do in the great state of Alaska as well. I'm not looking to add to their hurt. I'm working very hard, as are you, Mr. President, to put our oil field workers back to work and to get our flood victims the assistance that they need to recover from the tragedy that has befallen them. This bill is not about them. This bill is about able-bodied adults between the ages of 18 and 55 who have no dependents and who have been unemployed for years, in many cases by their own choosing. Our country has grown a lot and evolved a lot since Medicaid was introduced in 1965. We now face new challenges both at home and abroad. We know that. But Medicaid's grown as well. But it hasn't evolved in a positive way, in my opinion. Just 3 years after Medicaid was founded, we knew we were going to have a problem finding the money, given the exponential growth in the program. And more than 50 years later, it is way past time, Mr. President, to do something about it. We've got to break the back of poverty. This is not about throwing people out into the cold. This is about helping them to know the dignity of work, because the best program, the best social program in the entire world is a job. By implementing a work requirement, Mr. President, for able-bodied adults, Medicaid will evolve to the next logical step. Our goal ought to be to ensure, of course, that people are healthy That's what Medicaid exists for. But if you're healthy, then the next step is to help you join the workforce. The simple fact is, this is nothing new or extraordinary. We already have work requirements required by acts of this Congress for unemployment assistance, for welfare benefits, for subsidized housing, and for food stamps. Now, these requirements have been a success. We all know that. Not just for stemming the cost of those programs, but also for helping people, helping Americans build careers. Yet we do not have a requirement, a work requirement for Medicaid. If my bill passes, we will. Work requirements exist, Mr. President, because these programs are supposed to be safety nets. That's what a social program is, a safety net. They're not supposed to exist to permanently support you if you can support yourselves. Our social programs in America are meant to be bridges. In way too many respects, they become parking lots. Medicaid costs aren't just a national problem. The program's expense is clipping the states or the wings of states like Louisiana and like Alaska, because as I pointed out, the states have to put up a substantial amount of the money. We're becoming a country, Mr. President, in which people subsist instead of thrive because they don't know the rewards of working. We become a country in which poverty is a way of life for way too many people, and that's just sad. More than 50 years after Medicaid began, Mr. President, it's time to break the back of poverty once and for all, and we can start with a work requirement for Medicaid.